It sounds like an oxymoron. Europe preparing for war? But Russia's invasion of Ukraine finally woke the continent up and the world to the fact that the Cold War peace dividend has expired. With the Ukrainian war entering its third year, the potential for massive violence exploding in the Middle East, and troubles in the South Pacific, Europe's interests around the world are being threatened, and it's time to once more prepare for war. But how is each major player doing that? Let's take a look. Poland. Nobody recognized the threat that Russia poses more clearly than Poland and the Baltic states, perhaps unsurprisingly given their proximity. Immediately after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Poland knew what Europe had been reluctant to face. It could either fight Russia in Ukraine today or Russia on its border tomorrow. To that end, the nation was not shy about providing equipment and supplies to Ukraine, and even despite ongoing disputes between Ukrainian and Polish farmers, the support remains strong. The United States has been the biggest contributor of aid to Ukraine since the start of the war, but for its size, no nation compares to what Poland has given. There's a lot of talk currently about whether Ukraine could survive without American aid, given its use of Ukrainian aid as a political football by American conservatives. But it's worth asking if Ukraine could afford to lose Polish aid. Back in September, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki announced that Poland would no longer transfer equipment to Ukraine. And given that it's estimated Poland could lose as much as half of its fighting capabilities if it continues donating equipment, it's an understandable conclusion. Polish support is valued at around 3 billion euros, which is well ahead of nations with far bigger economies like the Netherlands, Italy, and France. The truth is, Poland might not be the largest supplier of aid to Ukraine by its value, but it is without a doubt one of the most critical suppliers of aid. While American HIMARS and Patriots and British Storm Shadow missiles are widely credited as significantly changing the course of the Russian offensive, none would have been possible without Poland's contribution in Cold War armored vehicles and other equipment. Warsaw has handed over 300 T-72 and modernized T-72 variants known as PT-91 main battle tanks, which put to shame the paltry 100 or so combined Leopards and Abrams that Ukraine's received from major military powers across the continent and the US. Sure, those tanks are nowhere near as capable, but they were easily adopted by Ukrainian forces and able to be put to immediate use. Poland has also given 300 BWP-1 and KTO Rosomak infantry fighting vehicles. The BWP-1 is a BMP variant produced in Poland, while the KTO Rosomak is a Polish-built wheeled armored personnel carrier, licensed from Sweden. Currently 100 KTO Rosomaks have been delivered, but another 200 are being financed by the US and the EU. Poland has also either outright donated or sold Ukraine badly needed artillery. But it was Poland that broke the fighter plane taboo early in the war by donating 14 MiG-29s and 12 Mi-24 attack helicopters. The early deliveries of the MiG-29s were labeled as spare parts, with the aircraft delivered fully operational. It's not just pragmatism, though, as Poland has happily shed nearly half of its combat capabilities due to a revitalization of its military. All of that gear is being replaced by more modern equivalents, and Poland has made a commitment to be one of, if not the strongest European military. Currently, Poland has around 128,000 active soldiers, and a new defense law will raise that to a minimum of 300,000 by 2035. It's also aiming to upgrade its military spending to 3% of GDP, a full 1% more than required under NATO guidelines, which most partners are failing to meet. Poland has historically been Europe's punching bag. It enjoyed a brief spot in the sun centuries ago, and since then has been ground zero for pretty much every major European war. Understandably, the Poles are looking to ensure that history does not repeat itself as Russia becomes increasingly aggressive and desperate. Poland recognizes what much of Europe is loath to. Like many ancient empires, Russia is crumbling from within and requires conquest to delay its own collapse. By 2035, Poland is aiming to have become an incredibly hard target, and with the acquisition of up to 1,682 tanks, 3,074 IFVs, and armored personnel carriers, 1,008 artillery systems, 648 MLRSs such as HIMARS, of which it has placed a major order for, and 160 combat aircraft, it's already entered into an agreement to purchase both South Korean and American tanks, with 366 Abrams and 180 K2 tanks ordered, and 14 Abrams and 28 K2s already in service. To dominate the skies, it purchased 32 F-35s, with more on the way, and 96 Apache helicopters. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, because Poland plans to buy another 820 Korean K2 tanks and over 600 additional artillery pieces of various types, while it has 20 U.S. HIMARS under contract, as well as 218 K-239 Chunmoo rocket artillery. It's planning to buy 70 more K-239s and a whopping 486 more HIMARS, which would give Poland even more HIMARS units than the United States of America. But can Poland really follow through on those massive purchases? It's doubtful it'll even receive all that equipment it's planning to buy, as few nations' long-term spending plans ever truly pan out as hoped. Poland's already canceled plans to buy additional Patriot batteries and a planned purchase of French helicopters. After losing out on a submarine deal to Australia with the AUKUS fallout, France is pretty upset about this latest cancellation of yet another military contract. Even if Poland only receives half of what it's planning to buy, it's already well on track to be the best prepared military in Europe for any major war. Already, America is calling Poland the most important partner in Europe, which must sting if you're German, considering Germany has been a central hub of U.S. military power in Europe and beyond since the end of the Second World War. Yet, with Germany's military atrophying and Britain in steep decline, Poland is set to be America's most important security partner on the continent. France. France is NATO's second most reluctant ally. But obstinate as it may be about, well, literally everything, France still operates Europe's second most credible military at the moment, directly behind Turkey. However, in the wake of the Ukrainian war, it's become obvious that France has a crippling problem, and it's not entirely clear that France itself has recognized that fact. While it may be outmuscled by Turkey, France likely has the best non-American fighting force on the continent at the moment. It's invested heavily into cutting-edge weapon systems, and unlike the rest of Europe, which was happy to either let America subsidize their security or look to lean heavily on partner nations, France has a largely independent capability, though it still relies heavily on the US for logistical support. This capability includes the continent's only ability to wield expeditionary firepower completely or at least mostly independent of the US. Again, it still requires logistical and intelligence support from its allies, but it can at least wage effective expeditionary campaigns, as evidenced by its interventions in Africa. But France has a quality over quantity problem, and it's not entirely clear if it's recognized that fact. While French weapons and combat systems are quite good and getting better, it has them in very few numbers. The nation has only about 170 tanks that are ready to go at any one time. And that's a very big problem, given that with its armored force, it can only last about 2 to 3 months in combat conditions similar to those in Ukraine. Its Leclerc could easily punch the lights out of anything the Russians could put on the battlefield. But the Russians can put a lot out on the battlefield, and despite crippling sanctions, are once more producing tanks at scale. Not necessarily very modern or very good tanks, but when you're all out of tanks and the enemy isn't, even an obsolete model is an immediately deadly threat to your infantry and support forces. France has also made some baffling choices in procurement, though. Against the advice of pretty much everyone, France procured the AMX-10 armored recon and wheeled tank destroyer vehicle in significant numbers. The vehicle performed satisfactorily in low-intensity conflicts, which was all that France predicted it would have to face. However, battlefield reports from vehicles donated to Ukraine are clear. The AMX-10 is a death trap. The vehicle packs an impressive anti-tank gun, but is so lightly armored that it's extremely vulnerable on the front lines. That's why France learned its lesson and is replacing its AMX-10s with the EBRC Jaguar, which is an AMX-10 but kind of beefed up and smarter. The Jaguar was at least sort of on target for one crippling problem with Western equipment. It's far more expensive to replace and takes longer to build, two deficiencies in high-intensity conflict. It features a commercial truck chassis and engine, which would make it very easy to produce these vehicles en masse. However, it also has a smaller gun than the AMX-10 it's replacing, and its armor is nowhere near as capable of protecting against the types of threats it'll need to face on the front lines. While it may protect from 155mm shell splinters, it's very vulnerable to enemy tanks and even IFVs. In a future major conflict, French infantry have no protected options for movement at the front other than a fleet of wheeled vehicles. While these feature excellent mobility, the lack of protection is a crippling vulnerability. In Ukraine, we've seen how American Bradleys have taken hits from everything from tanks to artillery and even drones, and their crews have lived to fight on. While the Jaguar and similar vehicles are excellent for counterinsurgency or low-intensity combat, They are simply unsuitable for industrial warfare. At least in the air, France is looking pretty healthy. Its standoff attack munitions have proven their worth in Ukraine, capable of penetrating even Russia's dense air defense networks and delivering crippling airstrikes. It plans to expand its fleet of Dassault Rafales from 100 to 185, though there are no plans to join the F-35 bandwagon due to a desire to focus on native defense industry. From an economics point of view, that makes perfect sense, but France is betting heavily on a joint partnership between itself, Spain, and Germany to develop a sixth-generation fighter. This leaves it with a lack of fifth-gen assets until its new generation fighter comes online around 2040, a serious problem given the tendency for weapons programs to experience significant delays, let alone multinational programs. There's no real indication France seems ready to chart a new course in military readiness, though. Instead, it's looking to continue prioritizing quality over quantity. During the Cold War, this was a winning strategy, as evidenced when the U.S. land-air battle was on full display against a far numerically superior Iraqi force equipped with almost entirely Soviet stock. U.S. and Allied weapons and capabilities were so far ahead of the Soviets that their quality easily won out over the Soviets' massive quantity. But that technological edge has not only eroded, emerging technologies are leveling the playing field across the board. The advent of weaponized drones alone has major military powers like America rethinking their need for a deep inventory of reserve equipment. In Ukraine alone, we have seen the apocalyptic losses inflicted on Russian inventory by drones, to the point that some old Soviet reserve depots are nearly tapped out. But France looks unwilling to change its doctrine, and this could place it at a significant disadvantage in the next major war, if not a war-losing one: Britain. In the course of a century, Britain has gone from a global empire to a nation that relies almost entirely on its nuclear arsenal to ensure its own safety. This has been a common criticism of the UK armed forces for years, but the war in Ukraine made it clear what its friends and allies had been saying all along: Britain can no longer defend even its home islands with conventional power. British weapon stocks were already insufficient for high-intensity conflict before the war in Ukraine, though that is a discovery that many modern nations are making. The donation of aging Storm Shadow missiles was a great boon to Ukraine and proved that despite their low numbers, Britain's advanced weapons allowed it to punch well above its weight class. Yet the procurement of Storm Shadow's replacement continues at a snail's pace, and Britain might be looking at acquiring less of the current Storm Shadow successor than it had in its inventory before the war in Ukraine. The British military has been on a slippery slope for about 2 decades. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, British troops got the nickname the Borrowers due to their constant need to borrow support equipment. As Britain tried to change the course around 2015, that year's Strategic Defense and Security Review had to be revised in less than a year, when it was clear that the current plan to modernize its armed forces was simply unaffordable. The nation's economic woes would only worsen with Brexit, the nation split from the European Union, largely spearheaded by influence operations waged by Russia to stoke up British right-wing support. COVID would be a double whammy for the nation, and it's still reeling to this day from the economic effects. Yet, the security environment is demanding more from the British defense budget at a time when the nation's able to invest less, creating a disastrous downward spiral in capabilities. Britain faces new threats in the Middle East to its regional interests, a crumbling security environment in Europe, and defense commitments in the South Pacific. To prepare for future wars, Britain is boosting spending on R&D to 2.4% of GDP, recognizing the need to stay on top of emerging technological trends. Breakthrough technologies are seen as a way of keeping the ever-shrinking British forces punching above their weight class, but the increase of R&D only brings Britain up to the global average. There's also a significant problem with Britain's cooperating with domestic defense industries, with bureaucracy creating obstacles to innovation and procurement that, in the words of one defense official, makes the Ministry of Defense, quote, one of the worst customers in the world. In the nuclear field, the UK is investing in modernization, but is facing the significant challenge of being reliant on the United States for supplying the actual Trident II D5 missiles that the nation uses. While the US-UK relationship remains strong, there is little fear of a break in relations. There are significant concerns over future presidencies similar to that of President Donald Trump, who heavily insinuated that the US would be better served with less cooperation with the European continent at large. This lack of faith in the continued partnership has prompted many in the UK to grow concerned with the UK's ability to field an independent nuclear deterrent. While Britain retains all political and military command authority over its own missiles, the missiles themselves are wholly reliant on the US for production and maintenance. Adding to the military's woes is critical manpower shortages. The British Army in 2023 numbered at 75,983, the lowest number since the Napoleonic Wars. A lack of investment is driving many to leave military service early, with 46% of those polled stating that they were separating due to substandard housing. However, militaries around the world are also struggling with retaining or recruiting, thanks to better opportunities available in the civilian sector. Though Britain is hit particularly hard, with today's diminished military, former British Defence Chief Lord Dannatt stated that the UK could not conduct the type of joint operations it performed in Iraq and Afghanistan. The current Defense Secretary Grant Shapps warned that Europe could no longer rely on the United States, quote, riding to the rescue. Yet, despite a call for increased defense spending, the UK is still projected to actually shrink its tank fleets, and while acquiring the F-35, its air force is also projected to shrink as well, with no solid plans to bolster its military or address significant supply shortages. The future of the UK is looking grim indeed in case of a major conventional war. Germany. The Bundeswehr, the army that I am allowed to lead, is more or less depleted. So wrote German General Alphonse Mace, chief of the German army, as Russia attacked Ukraine. And this is not an exaggeration, because no nation in Europe allowed its military to atrophy quite as badly as Germany. Historically speaking, nobody is super excited about a strong German military, but the nation has allowed its capabilities to shrink so badly that one of the world's leading economies could only contribute token forces to Allied-led conflicts. The nation completely failed to meet its NATO obligations, including its contribution to the Rapid Response Force, where to meet those requirements, it would have been forced to cannibalize other units just to muster up the required manpower and equipment. The German Air Force has been in a famous state of disrepair for over a decade, with maintenance issues grounding German planes and preventing them from meeting NATO air defense requirements. But this wasn't a surprise to German politicians. In fact, it was by design. While all of Europe is guilty of complacency in the wake of the Cold War and US military hegemony, no nation has been as criminally guilty of it as Germany. Politicians were fully aware of the state of the military and even its inability to defend itself from conventional threats. But it did not believe that a major conventional conflict would ever happen again. And with the largest American overseas military bases not on native soil, Germany wasn't particularly concerned about its own defense. German Prime Minister Olaf Scholz promised to reverse course in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, stating that Germany would revitalize its military with an investment of $100 billion. Yet, since then, the nation's military has seen little of that investment. While it has ordered 35 F-35s from the US, those won't arrive until 2027, leaving its fleet of Tornadoes incapable of fighting a protracted conflict. Making matters worse, the nation lost an entire year in 2023 by opting for a strategy of small incremental steps rather than the big decisive moves the nation needed so badly. Today, the nation is in no better shape than when Scholz made his promises at the start of the Ukraine war. On January 1, 2023, Germany took over the responsibility of leading NATO's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, which included 11,500 soldiers, half of which would need to be provided by Germany. Yet, the need to cannibalize other forces to fully equip the required men means there is little hope the VHRJTF would actually be prepared for battle within 72 hours as required by NATO. The future isn't looking bright for Germany either. It has pledged to make a 30,000-strong force available to NATO by 2025, yet international experts do not believe this will be possible. With only 183,000 soldiers, it's doubtful that Germany can recruit enough to make this force operational. Given that only a fraction of the military's total number is actual combat troops, like other nations around the world, Germany's facing a significant recruitment and retention problem. The nation is suffering from an acute problem when it comes to the military. Its professional soldiers are sick and tired of the neglect the Bundeswehr continues to suffer and see little reason to continue their service. This feeling has spread like a malaise through German culture, making the military an unattractive option to many would-be recruits. Germany has pledged that its military will be the defense backbone of Europe, putting out new defense policy guidelines over the decade. Yet today, of its 350 Puma infantry fighting vehicles, less than half are actually operational. A full third of its 312 Leopard 2s are down for maintenance. Only 30% of its PZH-2000 artillery pieces are operational. and the nation doesn't have enough medical kits for all of its combat forces. The future of the German military is in question. Much has been promised, but as we near the 2-year mark from a historic $100 billion rearmament promise, there is little to show. Now go check out US World War III plan or click this other video instead.